Tradition in the church tells us that the last of the apostles to die was St. John, the beloved of Jesus, that he died around the year 98 AD in Ephesus. By this time, St. John was an old man. He had trouble with his eyes as well as with his memory. But Sunday after Sunday, the people of Ephesus wanted to hear St. John preach at the Sunday Mass. They would have people brought over to his house to bring him to the church. And after the gospel was proclaimed, St. John then would preach. His homily consisted of one line, of 6 words. I suspect that some of you might be envious and think that maybe I should follow in St. John's footsteps. But St. John would have one line, 6 words. And what were they? My little children, love one another. My little children, love one another. And St. John would repeat this line over and over again. And as he did, the people knew what he was going to say in advance. Nobody looked at their watch. Nobody was wandering around to see what was happening. No one else was distracted. Despite them hearing this line over and over again, they heard it with a sense of a newness each and every time. And then when St. John got tired, he simply stopped saying, my little children, love one another, and Mass would continue on. And for the next 6 days of the week, the community in Ephesus would try to live by these words of St. John, my little children, love one another. Why was it that St. John preached these 6 words over and over again, Sunday after Sunday? Why, of all of the teachings, all of the words, all of the example that St. John had seen during the public life and ministry of Jesus, did he focus on those words? At the heart of who St. John was, he recognized that he had been loved first by God. And because he had been loved by God, he was able to receive that lavish, that gracious love into his heart and into his life. And because he had been first loved by God, then he was able to be the person of love back to God and to others. And this is why love was so important to St. John. He knew that nothing that he did or that he did not do would alter how God looked upon him. He came to realize, as the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches us, that God is the initiator. God is the one that loves us first, and we in turn then are called to love God back. But we are not the ones that begin loving God first. It begins with him loving us. And then because of that love, we have the ability, the capacity to be able to love God and to love others and to love ourselves. And this is why love was so important to St. John and why he encouraged his community week after week. My little children, love one another. As we gather to celebrate our Eucharist this evening, we hear both in our first reading from the book of Exodus, as well as in our gospel reading from St. Matthew, the sacred authors remind the people then and us today of this need to be able to live this love each and every moment in our lives, that we too are called to be people of love. This evening in our gospel, we hear of another controversy between Jesus and the religious authorities. Recall last week that the Sadducees and the Herodians were trying to test Jesus, trying to plot against him by asking him whether it was lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not. They were trying to discredit Jesus and to silence him. But instead, Jesus, being far more cunning than they could think or imagine, answered with that perfect response, give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and give to God the things that belong to God. And with that, we hear that he silenced his critics. But now, this evening in our gospel, we hear that his critics are back. The Pharisees are also trying to test Jesus. They are trying to silence him. They are trying to get his disciples to turn away from him. And so they ask Jesus another question. They ask him, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" Now, we may think to ourselves 2,000 years later, well, this wasn't a very hard question. There were 10 commandments. Jesus had at least a 10% chance in getting it right. But what we fail to recognize is that the people of the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, in fact, had 613 laws that they were expected to follow. There were laws of things that they could not do, and there were laws of things that they must do. And so they were asking Jesus, out of all 613 of these laws, which is the greatest of the laws? And Jesus, without hesitation, answers their question. He answers their question by quoting a passage from the book of Leviticus, where he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind." Jesus repeats to them the words that any good Jew would say the moment that they rose from their bed, and the words that they would say the moment they would put their head on their pillow, reciting this verse over and over again throughout the day. How sacred and important it was to be able to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And so when the Pharisees heard this, they realized that there maybe wasn't anything to trap Jesus. But Jesus then continued, and he says, "And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." This would have been a surprise, a shock to the Pharisees, that the greatest of the commandments was not only loving God with all of one's heart, one's mind, one's soul, but then also to love one's neighbor and to love oneself. This was a new and radical interpretation of all of the laws, all of the teachings of the Old Testament. And not only was it a radical realization for the Pharisees and the disciples, but then Jesus goes one step further and says, "On these two commandments hang all of the law and all of the prophets." In other words, Jesus was saying to them, if you get this right, if you love God and you love your neighbor as yourself, then all other 611 laws of the Old Testament will find their rightful place in your heart and in your life. But if you fail to love God and fail to love your neighbor as yourself, then you will miss the mark of all the other 611 laws, all the other teachings of the prophets and of the law. And so Jesus then elevates this great law of love, loving God and loving neighbor as one loves oneself. Is it any wonder then that the beloved disciple of Jesus, St. John, would then have repeated that sermon over and over again? My little children, love one another. For St. John recognized the supremacy of what Jesus was speaking about, loving God, loving one's neighbor, loving oneself. And this teaching of Jesus, this teaching of St. John, is still applicable for us today if we desire to be the faithful disciples of Jesus, if we desire to live out the call of our baptism and confirmation, then we too must be people of love, embracing this great love in our lives. But like St. John, like the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches us, we must first and foremost recognize the love that God has for us, not because of anything we have done or not done, but simply because God, in his lavishness, in his mercy, and in his generosity, has loved us first freely and unconditionally. And when we are able to accept, to embrace that love of God in our hearts and our lives, then the natural response for us will be to live the commandment of love, loving God back in return, and loving our neighbor and loving ourselves. This is why all of the law and the prophets hang on that realization, embracing God's love, and then out of gratitude for that love, sharing that love to others, to God, and to ourselves. But we recognize that as easy as this seems, we recognize how challenging it is to be a people of love. And why is it challenging to be a people of love? because oftentimes we misunderstand what real, true, authentic love is all about. When we look around at what's happening in our society, when we see what is happening in our culture, when we see what happens in the literature and in the movies and in the music that we listen to, we often get a very perverted and distorted sense of what love is. And oftentimes we confuse love with a feeling, that warm pitter-patter in the heart. And while it is true that love can be that pitter-patter in the heart, it is something certainly more than that. And so what is this real, authentic love that we are called to receive from God and in turn live and share with others? I think St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the great saints and doctors of the church, had the best definition of what authentic love is all about. St. Thomas Aquinas would often say that love is willing the good of the other for the sake of the other. Willing the good of the other for the sake of the other. The reason that I love someone, whether it be my spouse, my children, a best friend, or even a stranger that I meet on the street, is not because I want to receive that love back, not because I want to have a pat on the back, not because I expect some recognition or reward because of what I've done. That is not love. What real authentic love, St. Thomas Aquinas would say, is willing the good of the other. The reason that I love another person, the reason I help another person, is to be able to help them to be all that they are called to be. And what is it that they and we are called to be? We are called to be the saints of God. And therefore, as we reach out to our family, to our friends, to the strangers on the street, as we live this great call of love, this commandment of love, we are willing that they become holy, that they become saintly, that they become truly the children of God, not only in name, but moreover in action or deed. And this is what real love is about. This is why in the relationship between a husband and a wife, that their primary job is to make their spouse holy. This is why the primary job of parents is to make your children holy. This is the primary job of us as friends to one another, is to help make one another holy. And as we do so, then we are truly loving as God has called us to love. And as we do so, we help others then to be able to find their true identity as being the beloved of God. And therefore, if we desire to live out the call of our baptism and confirmation, to be people of love, then we must do so each and every day. That as we reach out to our family, to our friends, to our community, we are called then to reflect the love of God to them so that they might be able to embrace that love more and more in their lives, and in turn to be able to be people of love to others. And so tonight, as we celebrate our Eucharist, as we hear this great command of Jesus, let us allow ourselves to love God, to love our neighbor, to love ourselves. Let us remember the words of St. John the Apostle, "My little children, love one another." And each day, let us find tangible ways to be people of love, to will the good of the other for the sake of the other. And when we do so, then we experience the peace, the joy, the fulfillment that God has for us. For he has made us his children and called us to be his witnesses of life and love to others.